I finally finished world building, guys. What should the story be about? I love world building. Probably wouldn't have a whole channel dedicated to it if I didn't. But there are a lot of ways you can do it that don't actually help you, and I would say it's even possible to love world building too much. Especially if one's world building is just meant to be one of a number of pieces of an actual narrative. This topic is something I've hit on before in a few ways. Even the video that started it all had something to do with it. But as time passes, I learn both more about world building and how people interact with it. And so this video is basically a gathering of a few broad concepts of troubles I've seen befall world builders in the recent past. A menagerie of pain points, if you will. It almost goes without saying, especially for those of you who've been with the channel for some time, that world building is one of those endless topics that in the pursuit of writing some sort of speculative fiction is both fun and important. Fun and important is a great combination of things, and kind of a rare one at that, but it's also why this ends up being the impetus for some of what we'll talk about today. World building and a lot of tangentially related things like writing up backstories for side characters and all that sort of thing are something where you really want to aim for that golden mean. Good world building is the difference between an audience getting lost in your work and almost wishing they could live in it, and beating up their suspension of disbelief and spitting on its corpse. But you can have too much of a good thing. The image shown from the beginning comes from Writing Circle Jerk, one of the only places on Reddit related to writing I wouldn't tell you to avoid like the plague, but then again, I'd probably tell you to avoid Reddit in general like the plague, so I suppose that's not saying a whole lot. Regardless, this image illustrates a great point, and the other side of the coin to that which I've discussed before. If my video on lazy world building was about underdoing it, today I'm going to be talking a bit more about overdoing it, particularly in regards to how that can affect one's ability to actually work on doing the things that they want to do, and also just the reasons that the overdoing is done. But before this gets any more abstract and I ramble anymore, let's get into the meat of this with part 1, the everything box. The everything box is a phenomenon I'm naming a tendency I notice in basically everyone who world builds. I'm susceptible to it, my friends who world build stuff are susceptible to it, and it's a completely normal thing, but I want to discuss it. Writing and storytelling in general has essentially been one long game of, that was good, but I can do it better my own way, ever since Grug watched Thug stab a mammoth and drew a cave painting about it. Fast forward a year or two to the modern day, and with the advent of expansive fantasy worlds and the general popularity of speculative fiction, we've got a better chance and more opportunities to do that sort of thing than ever before. Now we can write whole worlds of things we borrowed, and if we're smart, make that world big enough to fit all of the things we could ever possibly want in it. You may well know this experience. You've got a world you're working on, and one day you read, watch, or play something that's just phenomenal. You can't get enough of it. You want to capture that vital essence, ephemeral it may be, of whatever made it great and shove it into your own world in the hopes of capturing or replicating that feeling, or turning it into something new. Over time, these things we steal, or borrow, become, or should become anyway, something that is truly your own as it's molded by your world and into your own styles of writing. But sometimes it just doesn't quite work. The everything box is what happens when, even if your execution isn't bad, there's still a fundamental failure in judgment, and things that really don't fit in your world are shoved into it anyway. But let me explain what this looks like with an actual kind of example. My world, as I'm making it, is one where I'm trying my best to emphasize real historical authenticity spawned from a lot of research I've put in to historical cultures and kingdoms and dynasties, and with some grim twists, but not going all the way into grimdark. The base concept isn't particularly innovative, but I'm trying to spice it up with that extra bit of deep lore history stuff and some vibes from things that I like that fit its theme. It's a world that isn't quite yet as bad off as Darkest Dungeon, but is maybe only a few bad days away. The world itself was spawned and inspired off of things like Darkest Dungeon, but also Fire Emblem Three Houses and Warhammer Fantasy in particular. This is no secret to any of you who've watched more than like 2 of my videos. Even now, as I'm reading the Farseer trilogy for the first time, I find myself wanting to steal things from that as well. It really is a wonderful series, and one with a tone and even a character-focused emphasis on the writing that, outside of world-building concerns, really matches my taste for actual prose. What might not be as obvious is that I do actually like a lot of fantasy worlds with much different aesthetics from those of which I've been speaking. I enjoy some good whimsy from time to time. I haven't read a ton of Pratchett, for example, but what I've experienced of him I've liked. I've dabbled in Narnia here and there as well, but those aren't really works that I love, not ones that I'd feel uber compelled to take inspiration from, except maybe the Pixies from the We Free Men. I might like them enough to do something with that concept sometime. But I love The Legend of Zelda. Skyward Sword is my favorite, and even despite Twilight Princess having an aesthetic I think most would assume I'd prefer, I just adore everything about Skyward Sword and its world. But the thing is, Skyward Sword has a fundamentally different approach to its world building and story from anything I'd probably ever write. And that's a good thing. In general, I think I've been consistent in recommending people to step outside of their comfort zones in media and seek out new things. But what that means for my world building is that if I want to borrow anything conceptually from Skyward Sword, it would need a lot more work for it to actually feel like it belonged in my world. If I took things from it, if that inspiration was not filtered through the context of my world, the integrity of my world would be damaged. The everything box is the phenomena, which I mostly notice in fantasy, but it could definitely happen in other genres, where you can get so used to fitting everything you want into your world that you try to incorporate things that really don't mesh because, man, I really didn't think about having floating islands in my world, and now I need to BS a way for them to be able to exist. The solution ultimately is pretty simple most of the time. Sometimes you just need to bite the bullet, and once your world's rules are established, not implement things that break them unless you want to change the rest of the world with it. But it's easy to kind of glaze over these issues and put things in anyway because you're so excited about the concept of having them. And following this issue is its common solution to explain away any problems caused by the everything box, as well as a lot of other things, and that is part 2, because magic. You might say, but J-Bat, the entire premise of fantasy is because magic. And this is generally true. You can have floating islands because magic, and it can be pretty cool. You can have superhuman spellcasters because magic. But you can't make your plot work because magic, nor your world believable because magic. As I've said in videos more dedicated to the wielding of magic by a world builder, in essence the most important thing magic can do is what it can't do. Magic needs limitations. That doesn't mean they need to be laid out and explained in detail for the audience, nor known by characters in world even, but it does need to exist somewhere. Mystery and unpredictability can be a valuable thing for magic, but one needs to be careful with what exactly they do with it. People who don't like fantasy sometimes cite, kind of fairly, that a plot where magic can or should be solving more problems than the plot allows it to is flawed. At the same time, a plot where magic propels it through means too convenient or out of left field to make any sense is obviously also going to come off as poorly written. How this applies to your world building can vary, but in essence, because magic is the de facto lazy explanation for when the author wants something to exist that breaks the bounds of the world, and they can't come up with an explanation that actually works. Either because the topic at hand is so broken that there really can't be a good explanation, or because they think the audience just might not quite notice. The issue isn't that you're not allowed to write exceptions to your rules, or that you shouldn't introduce new concepts that can expand or even redefine what magic can do in your world. I mean, if anything, doing that can play a big part in making a fantasy world feel larger or more fleshed out. But the issue is when these expansions play with the limitations you've previously established for the magic. But let me give you an example. Let's talk of our very old friend, protagonist Von Generic again. Remember him? It's been a while. But he's casting a fireball spell. Say for whatever reason, people in his world can only cast fireballs with a radius of exactly 6.9 inches, and doing that one spell is basically the absolute extent of magic's capability in his world. I mean, it's a pretty good-sized fireball. It's a lot bigger than something like a watermelon, for example. But say protagonist Von Generic encounters the infamous spellcaster Warlock the Evil. Warlock the Evil can cast a fireball with a radius of 7 inches. Crazy stuff, I know. That sort of thing isn't what I'm talking about. If anything, that scenario provides some intrigue. The audience might be curious to find out why exactly Warlock the Evil can cast a very slightly larger fireball than everybody else can, especially if that's the literal only variance in magic across the entire world. It's within a limit of reason that we can buy him maybe figuring out some way to squeeze out that extra tenth of an inch. But say protagonist Von Generic of the only 6.9-inch radius fireball world comes across Warlock the Evil, and then Warlock the Evil takes a slab of iron sitting next to him, telekinesis it into a Glock 19, and shoots protagonist Von Generic in the forehead. After replacing the contents of protagonist's head with lead, Warlock the Evil stares through the fourth wall towards an expectant audience and says, "I did it because magic." Here we have a great many questions. Not only is this entirely out of the span of possibility of magic, as we've had it so far introduced for that world, but it doesn't even make logical sense. A pistol like a Glock is made largely of plastic. Never mind all the materials that go into making the actual 9mm rounds for it to fire. These are all things you can't get out of a simple slab of iron. Now, obviously, this example is ridiculous, which is exactly how I like them, but this illustrates my point. You can't, because magic, your way out of everything. If you're going to expand the role of magic in your world and its capabilities, this is something you have to do gradually and with care. At the beginning of a story or when establishing the basics of your world, you can, because magic, almost everything. But once the rules are written and the precedents are set, you have to stick to them at a certain point. But I think that about covers that one. The next phenomenon I want to talk about is part 3, overpreparation. Overpreparation is kind of a nebulous thing, and those of us working with fantasy may all look to Tolkien and rightly see him as perhaps the greatest overpreparer in the entire genre. He has so much excess world building and story to the world of Middle-earth that there's a whole Silmarillion about it. His life's work was Middle-earth, and it was something he worked on for decades. But with him as a primary example to us of a successful fantasy writer, it's no wonder that some of us choose to emulate that kind of behavior. And that's not inherently a bad thing, but there is a limit. And in particular, there is another factor many people who do so fail to consider. I'm not one to impose some arbitrary limit on world building. I'm not going to say you really can have too much ready to go in case you need to pull it out somewhere in a story you're writing. Knowing your world well is very helpful for writing in it, and while it's also cool to write your story and sort of discover your world building as you do it, there's nothing wrong with having most of it laid out beforehand. I digress all that much just to say that world building can never be a replacement for actual prose writing, if a story is what you're intending to make. One of the reasons I emphasize that world building is both fun and important at the beginning of the video is because you can get to a point where you're convincing yourself that world building, a tertiary microstate that'll be mentioned once, is still important work relative to actually writing the body of your story. Does writing that microstate matter in some way? Maybe, but it's painting a house that you haven't actually built yet. Fundamentally, the most important thing you can do to better your world building is just to learn how to write prose better. A lot of what can make world building good has absolutely nothing to do with the actual inherent details of the world, but with how you're capable of conveying them. A 5 out of 10 world conveyed in a 10 out of 10 way is always going to be better than a 10 out of 10 world conveyed in a 5 out of 10 way. Hell, by the standards of a fantasy world, the real world is practically like a 3 or 4 out of 10 world. But if you read the right works, it being conveyed near flawlessly by writers like Faulkner makes the real world more beautiful than some of the best thought out fantasy worlds that have ever existed. Which speaks both to the fact that sometimes the real world is a lot more interesting than people who divert to fantasy all the time might give it credit for. I know I can be guilty of that sometimes. But also that the ability to convey good ideas is about as important as having the good ideas. Obviously, talking about the mechanics of bettering one's prose isn't something I really focus on with this channel. It's frankly not a topic a ton of people actively search for on YouTube, at least not within whatever niche it is I've found myself in. But trust me when I say that if you've ever felt that despite all the ideas you have for your world and how proud of them you are, that they never come out right in the writing, the problem does exist in the writing and not the world. I'd even go so far as to argue that even if you're someone not really planning to write prose, even if all you're writing for the world you're making is the world building itself, you still probably wouldn't go amiss studying how world building is implemented into other works by reading how they're written about. This is all pretty basic advice on the outset, I'll admit. The writing channel guy tells you to learn how to write. Unbelievable, I know. But it's really kind of an easy thing to overlook when you get really laser focused on the world building aspect. And more importantly, writing is hard, and that's where overpreparing can really kick you where the sun don't shine. I said something about this in the Sanderson video, I think, but it can be easy, especially if you've got a lot of world building done and not a lot of prose done, to just stay on the world building train perpetually, where you already have momentum, where you've gotten comfortable with adding new things to it, and where you feel like you have a foundation to work from already. Making actual progress on prose work never feels all that far away when you're stuck in this rut. You'll think prose writing can't be hard if I have all this world building to back it, can it? But then you sit down and you stare at an empty Word document for the actual manuscript for about 30 minutes and then decide, man, maybe world building the extended family tree of my protagonist's friend's third cousin would be a useful way to spend my time by comparison. Because then at least you feel like you're doing something. Even if you know it won't be relevant, doing something of only tangential importance feels better than trying to do something of great importance but not being able to. That's probably true for quite a few things, I guess, but especially this. And so the problem isn't actually really the over-preparation, it's the misuse of preparation, of extensive world building, to deflect the feeling that you actually aren't doing what it is you set out to do. Ask me how I know all of this. There was a period around 3 years ago where I basically did no writing for about a year, primarily because of this phenomenon. But there's a way out. Or at least there was for me, and hopefully it'll work for others. Most of the prose writers among you will probably have heard of the planner versus pantser debate. That is to say, do you write with extensive plans and laid out strategies for how you want everything to occur, or do you just sit down and let the prose flow? Almost everyone in my experience calls themselves a plantser. I was even in a seminar where the question was asked, and despite there being like 30 or 40 people in the room, I think everybody except maybe one person said they were a plantser. That's to say, they plan some things and seat of their pants others. It's a little silly, mostly because that's just how writing works. If you planned everything, the planning would almost just be the writing at that point. But more importantly, a lot of the people who call themselves plantsers are realistically like 20% planner and 80% pantser, when they might benefit from being more like 60% planner and 40% pantser. I say this especially to you, my audience, because I think, especially since a lot of us are working in this speculative fiction world, that planning is disproportionately helpful relative to how it might be in other genres. It's a little easier to go by the seat of your pants in a story set in our conventional world, where we generally understand the rules of things intuitively. But if you've got an entire constructed world and a complex, probably multi-novel plot with tons of characters and a detailed magic system, it would seem to me that any significant amount of pantsing is almost guaranteed to make your life a lot harder. Ask me how I know all of this. But here's the good news. Planning and world building are more similar than world building and prose writing. Planning is just world building for the events of your story, if you squint at it anyway. So my recommendation is, if you're one of those writers used to being able to write on the seat of your pants, but you've been struggling to actually start or consistently maintain progress, plan. Plan and plan and plan, and maybe when you've done a little more planning beyond that and have that detailed outline, you'll find that sitting down already knowing exactly what it is you need to write will make the writing a fair amount easier. Doesn't mean it'll be easy. Doing writing is always kind of hard, but it'll help a lot. Was this section just my excuse to spread pro-planner propaganda? Absolutely. No further comments. All that said, we should be about done for today. Anyway, if this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos early. As we close out, I'd like to thank those patrons of ours: Shadowrunner, Sani, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don, Sadako, Cavalier, Sazabi, and newly, a special thank you to Shieldmaid Fenya of the Knights of the Inner Circle. We also have Vion and Jodion Void, our Knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria, Lauren, and Noah, our loyal squires. And remember, planners of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but our pants.